August 6, 1945. Morning. A city vanished in a light so fierce it looked like the sun had fallen to earth. In the Imperial headquarters, reports arrived in fragments. Some papers spoke of a blinding flash, others of a fire that ate streets whole. Radio voices cut out mid-sentence. The phones were dead. General Anami stood with a thin sheet of paper between trembling fingers. Someone else murmured the same word over and over, as if repetition could make sense of it. Impact. There was denial. There was a measure of hope mistaken for strategy. Honor hung in the air like a heavy coat no one wanted to remove. What the High Command said in the next hours would shape policy, survival, and the meaning of responsibility for generations. And in this account, we open the door to that sealed room to trace how disbelief became decision. At first, the accounts contradicted one another. Captain Hayashi sent a terse radio line, then silence. Lieutenant Kuroda reported a mushroom cloud from the coast. Colonel Nakajima read a teleprinter that spoke only of an explosion, and listed casualties as numbers without faces. Admiral Saito asked if the message was a forgery. Minister Togo barked a short dismissal. Voices overlapped like bad reception. In the meeting room, the light bulbs buzzed. The smell of cigarette smoke and boiled tea mixed. Papers rustled under sweaty palms. A young officer, Sergeant Ito, whispered, "This cannot be." An older adjutant, Masaru Fujimoto, tapped his pen against the desk and said, "We must confirm." The denial was both strategic and human. "It is impossible," General Anami said aloud, and that single sentence became a defense and a mask. A clerk handed a pilot's log to the commander. "We have a witness," the clerk said. Captain Hayashi reported a flash, a cloud rising at 40,000 feet, then nothing. The room fell into a silence that sounded like an accusation. A report from a pilot turned the argument into sight. The pilot's words were read aloud with a voice that shook. Captain Hayashi spoke in a later affidavit, and in the original report he wrote, "I saw a white light, brighter than the sun. My skin prickled. The radio hissed. Then the city was a blank." Those present were forced from abstraction into sense. The air in the briefing room tasted of dust and fear. Boxes of files smelled of old starch, and the sound of a pencil dropping seemed monstrous against the quiet. Dr. Takeda, a scientist from the ministry laboratory, described what the pilot had likely seen. He used plain language and cold facts. A rapid release of energy at a point source can create a shock wave of heat and light beyond anything experienced in conventional bombing, he said. He explained thermal radiation, blast pressure, and the possibility of widespread radiation in terms the generals could imagine, like a furnace moved across a city. His voice was even, his hands were steady. Yet when he mentioned the word radiation, a few officers flinched as if touched. An investigation team set out to the site. Lieutenant Kuroda, Corporal Nakamura, Dr. Takeda, and two intelligence officers, Hiroshi Sakamoto and Emika Watanabe, traveled by truck along roads that smelled of oil and char. They encountered wreckage, the silence of empty streets, and a metallic tang in the air. They felt heat on their faces even hours later, the grit of ash under their boots. A survivor they found, a man named Kenji Matsuo, coughed and held out a scorched scrap of clothing. He smelled of smoke and salt and grief. The team radioed back images and a field report. The transmissions came distorted. In the headquarters, the photos were spread on a table. Faces around the table went white. "Is this war or annihilation?" asked Colonel Nakajima. "What do we tell the families?" asked Masaru Fujimoto. The concrete reality eroded official narratives and forced the question of responsibility. In the command room, experts argued with equal vehemence. Dr. Takeda stepped forward with technical clarity. He illustrated how an explosive chain reaction at a critical mass could produce a fireball, how radioactive fallout could travel with wind, how infrastructure would be irrevocably compromised. He used diagrams drawn on a scrap of paper, tapped the margin with a pencil, described half-lives and contamination in simple terms. If this is confirmed as a new type of weapon, he said, it is not only a military challenge, it is a political and humanitarian crisis. The debate moved quickly to numbers and possibilities. Admiral Saito asked how many more could they have. Dr. Takeda replied, "We cannot be sure, but if the mechanism is a deliverable device, several could exist." Minister Togo demanded options. General Anami weighed honor against survival with visible strain. "We will investigate," he said. "We will not surrender without cause." Lieutenant Kuroda responded, "But what of the civilians?" Colonel Nakajima added, "Our obligation is to the people." These exchanges formed the texture of a dilemma between fighting to the end and negotiating some form of surrender to prevent further victims. The room became a stage for moral argument. Dialogue thickened. "We must resist," said Admiral Saito. "Resistance has been our duty." "And our duty is also to protect civilians," replied Minister Togo. "If we continue, we risk annihilation," countered Dr. Takeda. "If we surrender, we lose honor," said General Anami. "Is honor a reason to sacrifice our cities?" asked Colonel Nakajima. "What do you propose?" demanded Minister Togo, voice low. "Open negotiations," said Lieutenant Kuroda. "At least buy time for evacuation." There were breaths taken, cups of tea untouched, the scrape of shoe leather on the floor. These 5 or 6 exchanges revealed layers of emotion, shame, calculation, and fear. The sensory details were vivid, the chair fabric scratchy against thighs, the stale tobacco on the air, the muffled clock ticking like a distant countdown. New information kept arriving and forced choices. A second report suggested further unexplained blasts at other sites. International messages crowded the teleprinters. Public panic began in port cities. Evacuation orders were whispered in markets and shouted in factories. Names of secondary officials appeared in dispatches. Emiko Watanabe coordinated evacuation corridors. Hiroshi Sakamoto secured food convoys. Corporal Nakamura led a rescue team into a ruined neighborhood. Their actions created a mosaic of response that spread beyond the walls of the headquarters. The High Command watched newsreels in black and white at the ministry, and the images of wounded civilians, burned buildings, and empty plazas pressed the argument from abstract strategy to human consequence. The ultimate moment came when the sovereign voice had to be invoked. The emperor took counsel. A brief exchange of statements reached the cabinet room. "What is our duty to the nation?" asked the emperor through his chamberlain. "To preserve the throne and the people," replied Prince Kano in measured tones. The decision that followed carried personal consequences. General Anami later recorded feelings of unbearable weight, and private acts of atonement among some officers surfaced, including public resignations and at least one controversial account of self-punishment recorded by a junior aide. Words like sacrifice and responsibility moved from philosophy to action. The choice made by the highest authority altered command structures, led to immediate cessation of offensive orders, and to quiet preparations for contact with foreign channels. 1 month later, the nation reeled. Evacuation orders had moved thousands out of cities. Relief committees were formed under names like the Imperial Relief Office, led by Emiko Watanabe, and supply lines managed by Hiroshi Sakamoto. The smell of smoke lingered in coastal towns. Hospitals run by Dr. Takeda and a team including nurse Yumi Tanaka filled with victims whose symptoms were both visible and enigmatic. 3 months after the event, policy shifted. The government opened reluctant communications with foreign powers. Admiral Saito and Minister Togo negotiated the terms of a provisional armistice, while debate over honor and surrender continued in private letters and public statements. 6 months on, memorials were being erected in towns that had not burned. Legislation begun to address civilian protection was debated in the Diet, and a new vocabulary entered public life. legacy, consequence, and responsibility. Historians would later point to the day the command learned a city was gone as the hinge on which 20th century policy turned. This is not merely a story of strategy. It is a story of people who smelled smoke and felt heat and then had to decide. It is about honor facing the mortal test of survival. It is about a command that moved from disbelief to analysis to decision, and about the victims whose names became statistics and then became faces. If you felt the weight of that room, now tell us in the comments what you would have done if you were in that chair. Would you have chosen honor or saved lives? Start your reply with, "I would choose." If this account moved you, consider subscribing for more. More analyses that open sealed rooms and name the choices that shaped our world. One flash, one report, one decision, a new world.